Welcome, and we're on to the Parsha of Metzorah this week. Normally, Tazria, what we did last week, and Metzorah are combined very, very often, but because this is a leap year, they are separated out, and so we're going to get right into that. And here we are. So at this point, of course, we're starting this Parsha completely. And essentially, we're going to see that it has to do with the ceremonies that would take place when someone who's pronounced a Metzorah is in fact healed, and what this person has to go through. So last week, we were talking about diagnostics. We were talking about those areas which can in fact go through something called tzara'at. Towards the end of the Parsha, I will tell you that we added as well clothing. That is clothing made out of wool, and I believe linen too, and for sure skins that's made out of leather. That all these three other kinds of garments can in fact be subject to Metzorah, and just as it did in the other cases, the Torah gives us how these are basically to be diagnosed. So here we talk now about the process in which someone is healed. And it isn't just a matter of being healed. It's a matter of a process by which one cleanses oneself. And there's some interesting Rashi where he gets actually into some explanations of what causes tzara'at. Towards the end of this chapter, we also talk about the fact that homes, that is to say, the walls of a home, can also show indications of tzara'at. And then we have a brief section that deals with general issues of personal tum'ah, that is impurity that can come from a seminal emission or from going through menstruation. So it applies both to men and women and what's involved there. As you know, generally I try to understand what is causing these particular items and to see what the tradition has to say from its spiritual, psychological elements. So we're going to go into this. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
And it starts off innocently enough with a phrase, a verse that is said many times in the Torah. Vaydaber Hashem. Hashem spoke El Moshe Lemor to Moses to say. Onwards. Zot tihiyeh, this shall be. Torah, the instruction, HaMetzorah, for the one who has tzara'at, the Yom Tahoroto, on the day that he is purified. V'huva el hakohen, and he shall be brought to the priest. So we see again how involved the priest is in this whole process. So I don't know that I've ever discussed this before, but the word Torah, which if you know basic Hebrew, one of the first words you learn as a Hebrew, when learning Hebrew, is the word moreh or morah, which means a man teacher or a female teacher. And so essentially it has to do with teaching or instruction. So this is the word Torah. It's related to this idea of teaching, with a capital T. From this, we can actually derive some important ideas. This is such a central idea that there is something that we can call divine instruction that is available for us. And it in a sense, gives you the purpose of life, which is if Torah means instruction, then our purpose then is to learn. And it also, we can go a step beyond that, which has to do with something of how we would understand or try to articulate the nature of the divine. And so it's interesting. Sometimes God is described as a warrior, and of course a lawgiver, but essentially we can understand God as being the teacher par excellence. That our basic idea of strength, of purpose, etc., have to do with learning. So here we go. Zot tiye Torah Metzorah. This shall be the instruction for the Metzorah. And this is from the Talmud Megillah in page 21, etc. Melamed. So this teaches she'ein mitaharin oto balayla, and because it says this teaches that one does not go through this purification process during the night. Why? Because it says beyom tarato, on the day that he is purified. And of course, we could understand day simply as being a 24-hour period, but this is understood as why even this word, that this word is, it could have said Hamatzorah v'tarato, when he is purified. So why dafka the yom? And that's what we can infer from this. Let's see if there's anything else. No, going to go on. And we said he's brought to the priest. V'yatsa hakohen el michutz lamachane. And the priest shall, so even though it says v'huva, which is passive, he shall be brought, nevertheless it goes on to say that this process is done by hakohen going out, the priest going out el michutz lamachane, outside the encampment. V'ra'ah hakohen, and the kohen shall see, v'hinei, and indeed nirpa nega hatzarat, and indeed the wound of tzarat has been healed from the one who is afflicted with tzarat. So, el michutz lamachane. So why does it mention that he has to go outside the encampment? So Rashi explains, chutz l'shalosh machanot, he goes out of the 3 camps. This is referring back in the days when the Jewish people were in the desert and wandering through the wilderness. And we read about this at the beginning of the book of Numbers, how the camp is divided into 3 levels of holiness. So you could say there is the encampment of Mishkan, of the tabernacle. Remember, it had an enclosure. Right outside of that were, on 3 sides, there were the 3 Levitical families, and then Moses and Aaron and their families were outside the entrance to the tent of meeting. The other Levitical families around the other 3 sides. That's Machane Leviah, the Levite encampment. And then outside there is Machane Yisrael, is the encampment of the Israelites. So now there are 3 encampments, and then outside of that is basically where they would keep their flocks, but that is where, in fact, the lepers had to go as long as they were still experiencing leprosy. So he says outside, he has to go outside the encampment, meaning the whole 3 camps, shenishtalach sham, because he was sent there, bimei chaluto, during the days when it was decided that he was a leper, when the priest had declared him a leper. So there were limitations in terms of entering any one of those camps. So for the Israelite encampment, you could not go into it if you were a leper. However, there were other kinds of impurities that you might have contracted, but you were permitted to go into the Israelite encampment. Later on in this Parsha, we discuss somebody called a Zav or a Zava, which is somebody who they've translated it as gonorrhea, but it means essentially an uncontrolled flux of semen or blood, And this requires certain types of, it's a deeper form of impurity. If you're suffering from that, you cannot go into the Levitical camp. And then, of course, into the camp of the tabernacle. If you have pretty much any impurity, you cannot go into that. Obviously, there's quite a lot to unpack in the fact that one is not allowed to go into certain places within certain conditions, and whether or not that actually is helpful. David.
Yeah, so I'm assuming the Kohanim were in the camp of the tabernacle. Is that correct?
No, the Kohanim would have lived. Remember, it was Aaron and his family who were Kohanim at the time, and so of course the Kohanim lived in the entrance of the tabernacle, outside the tabernacle, but at its entrance.
Right. Okay. And then after that was the outside of that was the camp of Leviticus, right? And then the Israelites.
No, outside that. Okay, the Kohanim were part of the encampment that was the Levitical encampment.
Okay, got it.
Right.
Got it.
So
okay.
Both the Kohanim and the Levites lived within that precinct of the Levitical encampment.
Okay, the Kohanim just lived closer to the entrance to the temple than the Levites did, right?
Correct.
Is that correct? Okay,
yes, I think that would be a good observation.
Right. Okay, I was just trying to figure out where they lived. I figured it was in one of those two. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Of course. No, I'm glad you clarified that. Just to try and think a little bit more, that sometimes, we talk about in art, we sometimes talk about negative space, right? And that sometimes not doing something is part of a process of being able to transition into something else. And I'm trying. There's a proverb. My mother taught it to me in Yiddish. She used to use the Yiddish for it, and essentially it says, the proverb goes, "When is the beggar happy?" And the answer to that question is when he finds the thing that he lost. And of course, the whole point about it is that in that sense, it's talking about our sense of entitlement and the fact that we don't appreciate so many things because we have them and we're so used to having them that we don't appreciate them anymore, right? I think the English equivalent would be familiarity breeds contempt. And so not having something sometimes allows you to appreciate it when you have it. And of course, if in fact the reason why one would get leprosy had to do with gossip and bad mouthing, then not being able to go into the community makes you realize how important it is to become part of a community, and how one of those ways in which we ensure the existence of a community and don't destroy it is by avoiding bad mouthing. And I would, forgive me for reaching into political for a moment, but if we look at the current climate of the United States and the degree to which it is divided, etc., a lot of it has to do pretty much with the bad mouthing that has gone on between one party and another party. And so I think there's a profound thought here about the need to be charitable and kind when it comes to judging people. And they do say, in Hebrew, there's a saying, Dan chavercha lachaf zechut. I believe it's actually from Pirkei Avot, which means judge your fellow on the scale of righteousness. In other words, assume a person is decent or has decent motivations, etc., and don't assume the worst of people. So just this, when you think about how this sort of stuff destroys the fabric of a community, you start to realize that this is pretty important stuff. And it's possible that by the Torah describing it, as we've said last week, about yucky things, that it's a really yucky thing. And maybe if we saw bad mouthing and slander and stuff as yucky as it really is, maybe it would help us avoid it, because we like to avoid yucky things. So again, some of the deeper stuff that's actually behind what's going on. At any rate, it's not easy to repair the damage that one causes when when you engage in bad mouthing. Because as I'm sure we've all said, is that once we release the words, we just can't take them back. And of course, perhaps more recently, we've seen something going on with the Academy Awards, and my gosh, it just keeps going on and on as to what happened there. At any rate, what's also lovely here, I think, is the fact that the priest himself has to go and leave his exalted place and go into this camp. It isn't just the leper or the one who has tzara'at, the tzarua, who has to do all the work. The priest is also deeply involved in this, because after all, it was the priest who had to declare this person a Metzorah. So here we go. So Vitziva HaKohen, okay, and the priest should instruct, command, V'lakach lamitaher, and he should take to the one to be purified, shtei tziporim chayot torot, two birds that are alive and are pure. The eitz eres and cedar wood, ushni tolaat, and crimson. Tolaat would be crimson. Forgive me. It's actually tolaat. Either is from a word that means a worm. So some translate it as silk. Rashi, as you'll note from the Talmud, describes it as wool. So, and shani has to do with a color. That's the crimson. Okay. And here we have it. And I noticed, if you will notice, that the ephod, right, and the hangings of the Mishkan that we read at the end of Exodus had something called tola'at shani in them. So again, some significance in regards to those colors and those materials, but that they're part of the fabric of the tabernacle and the ephod of the priest. So he takes the cedar wood, he takes two birds, he takes cedar wood, shni tolat, and red yarn, let's call it for the moment, right? The azov and hyssop. And Rashi is going to explain why these particular items. So, first of all, it says, shtei tziporim chayot torot. Well, he doesn't take dead birds. So again, is there some special reason as to why it mentions that they're chayot, alive, and are pure? Right. Well, we have learned in Parshat Shmini that there's certain birds that are pure and certain birds that are not considered pure. Basically, when they're pure, we can consume them, we can eat them. If they're impure, we're forbidden to eat from them or their eggs or anything like that, okay? But here we go, chayot. And from the tractate Chulin, which discusses kosher meat that can be eaten, as opposed to kochim, which would be meat that is dedicated or is somehow sanctified, sacrificial. Whereas, of course, we go to the kosher butcher and we can get meat that we're allowed to eat. And of course, the whole idea of eating meat is something that we want to treat in a very special way. At any rate, it says chayot, prat l'treifot. So he says it's to exclude a bird that is considered treif. So just to explain treif, literally it means torn. In other words, so for example, an animal that was attacked by another animal and has survived, but it also has to do with an animal. An animal is treif. Even though it's living, it's considered treif if in fact it's likely to die within a year on account of its wounds. And so just to explain how the practical implications of this is that we know that to be kosher, an animal has to be slaughtered in a very special kind of way. It's instantaneous, essentially. So the person who does that, who performs what is called shchita, that's the slaughtering of an animal, shchita. But also, very importantly, as part of that process, there is an individual called a bodek, a checker, someone who checks. And it's not just enough to have shchita, but one has to then examine the animal. And the bodek is the one who essentially examines the lungs of the animal to make sure there aren't what are called sirchot, adhesions in the lungs. And the assumption is that certain types of adhesions that affect the lung of the animal would cause it to die within the space of a year. I believe it is the space of a year. So the animal is then examined to make sure that it's healthy and is not trafe. And there are other kinds of indications that don't require necessarily expertise to determine. So, example, certain broken limbs or stuff like that. But just to know, this is a bird, in this case, one that is fully alive. And the idea of trafe, meaning, although we usually know the word trafe as meaning unkosher, but it's a special type of not being kosher. Tahorot, pure. Prat, so the reason again why the Torah adds these particular words to the description of the birds is to exclude of tameh, an impure bird. Why? So now Rashi goes into this. The fisha negaim ba'im. He says these wounds occur, this kind of leprosy specifically we're talking about, they arrive, they come, al lashon hara. There he is. Says it, quoting from the tractate Arachim, that they occur on account of evil language, evil tongue. Shahu ma'aseh pitputi or pitpute dvarim. This is an activity of verbal chatter. And I think the reason why especially this is singled out is because there is no physical damage being done. You're not attacking a person with anything physical, but you're attacking them with words. And because you're attacking them with words, and you cannot necessarily see exactly how this person has been injured, but you have caused a serious injury to someone else, or a person has caused serious injury to someone else through their verbal chatter. Lefichach, and for this reason, huskaku the Torah to tziporim. It is necessary for his purification, birds. Shemit patatim tamid, because they're constantly chattering, but sif kol, with their verbal, or not verbal, but loud, noisy chatter. Kol means voice, with their vocal chattering. And so the birds symbolize that in terms of the process of becoming part of the camp again. And the idea, of course, that in having to sacrifice these birds, you have to sacrifice this particular element of one's behavior. In other words, whenever you're talking about a return of this kind, right? The Hebrew word, of course, is tshuva. And so the idea of true repentance and feeling bad about what you've been doing and being willing to face up to it is very, very important. The 8th areas. So this is a cedar wood. Again, lefi shahan negaim ba'in al gasut haruach. And the reason is that negaim, tsarat, etc., come on pride. Gasut haruach means elevating or increasing or enlarging your spirit, your wind. In other words, arrogance. So essentially, when you're bad-mouthing someone else, you're looking down on them. You're considering them not as good as you are. And so again, we're going to see why a cedar tree. So I believe cedar trees are very beautiful. And again, you're taking this cedar tree to remind you, and it's part of an offering, right? So that you're offering up your arrogance, to try and be conscious of it and try not to be that way, recognize it. Vishani Tolat, I'm going to ask whoever isn't muted to please mute themselves. And this is this crimson wool, the Azov and hyssop. Ma takanato v'yitrape. What can he fix himself with so that he can become healed? Yashpil atzmo, he should lower himself, miga'avato, from his pride, ketolat, like a worm, uka'ezov, and like hyssop. So I actually tried to find a picture of hyssop. Let me see if I can find it quickly. 1 second. Okay. Please. I'm sorry, I'm trying to find the picture of it. And I had it a moment ago, and now I don't see it, but I'll get it up so you can see what it looks like. Hold on a second. Okay. So here's some pictures of hyssop. Okay. That's what hyssop looks like. So it's, whether this is the biblical hyssop, I'm not absolutely certain, but the idea is that it's something that can bend very easily, etc. So there we are. Go back now to what we were at. Moment, please. 1 second. And so again, describing in quite detail about that idea of what this is all about. And with this, I am going to stop the share. And we can pause just a moment if you like, if anyone has anything they'd like to comment on before I stop the recording.
Is that hyssop, whatever they call it, is a weed? Is a weak weed or something, a bush or what?
Well, it looked like a bush of some kind. It looked like a flowering plant, and it's a humble plant, I guess. At least that's how it's understood. I'm assuming that what we call hyssop now is what this plant is in the Torah.
And cedar wood is a hardwood?
Well, it's more that the tree is quite a magnificent tree. We talk about the cedars of Lebanon. We know again that, by the way, that these particular, what's so interesting is that these particular items are also mentioned in connection with the construction of the tabernacle and the temple and the priesthood. So again, there's this idea of modesty, right? And trying to live a modest life. And that the temple is trying to teach us that particular lesson. And I think with this, I'm going to stop the recording for today.